Good afternoon from a rainy Johannesburg. It's pretty cold out there, so if you're joining us, I'm sure this is probably a warmer place to be. Welcome to this Wits Centre for Journalism webinar, which focuses on recent research on the shortcomings of previous policy interventions in sustainably growing the community media sector, in particular in South Africa. South Africa, of course, is one of the most unequal countries in the world, with mega wealth existing alongside, sometimes literally, in terms of spatial allocation, the poorest of the poor. Outside of its cities remain a vast population still very much underserved by basic utilities, including internet access and media. I'm joined today by Franz Krüger, an associate professor based at the NLA Hochschule in Norway and a research associate with the Wits Centre for Journalism, Jayshree, an independent development and community media specialist, and Kate Skinner, the executive director of the Association for Independent Publishers in South Africa. And let me not assume that you know who I am. My name is Dinesh Balia. I'm the director of the Wits Centre for Journalism at Wits University. My three colleagues, of course, are not unfamiliar to the South African media landscape and, dare I say, are bordering on veteran status. Not sure they'll agree with me. Franz and Jayshree's research, together with Professor Sarah Chiumbu, a media and communications academic at the University of Johannesburg, is captured in the Leveling of the Playing Field report supported by the Deutsche Welle Academy. I think Peter Dessler is with us from the Deutsche Welle Academy, who supported this research. I wonder, Peter, if you could say a few words from your side before we kick off.
Yes, hello to everybody. And I think a special thanks to the researchers and to the Wits Centre for Journalism. And just I'm really looking forward to hearing the content points, and I'm really grateful that we could still publish this research, which originally was funded and cooperation with CIMA, one of the many media development initiatives that was cut short by the US funding cuts. But I think it's really great that we could kind of catch that ball and still manage to publish this great research. I've read it, and I'm really looking forward to listening to all of that. My name is Peter Deslers. I think I also forgot to introduce myself. I'm the program director for DW Akademie in Southern Africa. We're based in Windhoek, and we work regionally in mainly the smaller SADC countries, or let's say not in South Africa that much, but in the SADC countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, Namibia, Zambia. On journalism education, journalism training, innovation in the media sector, media and information literacy, and advocacy for media freedom. Yeah, and I think it's very good to have a publication that looks into the viability of small and local media. And I'm really looking forward to taking a couple of the lessons learned there from South Africa to other countries like Malawi, like Namibia. I think where a lot of people also look into how can we support community media better.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you to the Deutsche Welle Academy for their ongoing support for journalism development, particularly community media on the continent. I'm going to go back to you, Jayshree. If you are ready, let's kick off. I think you are sharing a presentation.
Thank you, yes. And I hope that the presentation is visible. Just to say, we gave our co-conspirator a bigger picture because she's not able to join us. And also just to apologize in advance. It's bad form to start with an apology, but you'll hear that my dulcet tones are not as clear as they should be. It's the rain, it's travel, but hopefully you'll be able to bear with me. Just to say that I'll do the first part, and then I'm going to hand over to Franz to look more critically at the recommendations. As everyone knows, it's 30 years of democracy in South Africa, and we thought it was a very opportune moment to examine post-apartheid policy interventions that were really rooted in and anchored in terms of democratizing media, particularly in terms of our past. And for this study, we really focused on community radio, community media, small independent publishers, a little bit on community television, which always seems to be a little bit of the orphan, and I think that comes through in the research itself, and online media in marginalized communities. The primary purpose was really to look at successes, failings, and to draw lessons that we thought are critical for other global South contexts that also grapple with high levels of inequality. In terms of context and purpose, apartheid left deep inequality in information access. Urban white audiences had many options. Rural, poor, mostly Black communities relied primarily on state-controlled radio. Post-1994, reforms aimed to make information a public good, and I think that's a very critical principle that we need to constantly remember and bring back into the discussion as we talk about this, and to really enable our participatory democracy, which again, our constitution is so clear on. In the early phase, between the early 1990s and the 2000s, there was a lot of optimism. I think Dinesh used the word veterans. I think it's a very good description in many ways. And I think about that phase as really we were so ready for building democracy. But along with that, building the institutions that were necessary for this. And this period was also marked by a lot of grassroots and civil society support. Again, a very important point. In the later phase, from the 2000s to the 2020s, what we see in the community media landscape is mirrored in terms of what's happening at the broader political landscape. A lot of political fracturing, institutional instability, grappling with the high levels of economic inequality, and then, of course, factoring in digital disruption. Our research approach was really to look at reviewing policy documents, legal frameworks, and existing institutional arrangements. We conducted a limited number of interviews with policymakers, regulators, publishers, broadcasters, and civil society. We also drew on new empirical data on content, business models, and sector trends. What the research shows is that there are many, many wins to celebrate. Media freedom and pluralism cannot be underestimated, especially when we see what's happening elsewhere on the continent and globally. So we are very fortunate in South Africa to have constitutional and legal protections that place South Africa in the highest in Africa for press freedom. So we're looking at the RSF index, and we were ahead of the UK and the USA. We also have an independent regulation, certainly for broadcasting, through what was originally the IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, to what is now the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, ICASA, with anti-monopoly provisions. And very critically was the preservation of a three-tier broadcasting system: public, commercial, and community. In the past 30 years, there's been significant growth. Community radio, there have been 232 licenses issued by 2022. It should be noted that not all are active. And this reaches an audience of about 8 million people weekly. On the print side, the AIP has got members throughout the country, 191 members in 2024, majority founded after 2004. And across broadcasting and print, we have content in all official languages, plus other languages that reflect the diversity of South Africa. And this is really a gold vein for us. The sector has been really foundational in building capacity and skills. Community media serves as a training ground for journalists and other media practitioners, and civil society influence in those early days of policy reform ensured broad participation and diversity. I think one of the gaps is we're not measuring this, this contribution sufficiently. I think I've made the point about our media freedom. But of course, there are challenges. And one of the big challenges that South Africa faces is the persistent inequality. I think we all know the levels of unemployment, particularly amongst young people. And the distribution of community media is really skewed towards metropolitan townships, with the poorest rural areas remaining underserved. News deserts reflect the socioeconomic divides that we confront as a society. A second really big factor is the fragile sustainability of these media projects. Many have very small budgets. The annual median turnover is around 500,000 per year for broadcasting. For print, it's even less, given that the high costs of printing, etc., and that's 250,000. There's a great reliance on government advertising and small local advertisers. Very little donor funding. A third challenge is institutional instability. As mentioned before, the sector has mirrored broader developments in the landscape. So there have been lots of ministerial changes. There have been 7 ministers in the portfolio that this area of work falls under. There's been the Media Development and Diversity Agency, which has also been plagued by leadership turnover, high levels of leadership turnover, scandals in the media, reduced funding impact, and quite frankly, huge demand and expectation for a very small budget. I always remind people that when the first discussions about MDDA started, the budget that we thought we needed was 500 million. We're not even close to reaching that yet. So I think that's something we'll come back to in the discussion. There are also policy and regulatory weaknesses. So there have been weak systems to prevent capture and factional conflict. We've had often in the news reports about stations being occupied by unhappy communities. There have been cases of arson, and there have been several cases of political interference. Within this, community television, I think, occupies a very special place because it has been hampered by policy confusion and costly digital migration delays. The cost of running a community television is much higher than running a community radio station. And there has also been, the sustainability challenges have been much greater. So, some of the critical lessons. There's been an implementation gap. While South Africa is very fortunate to have well-designed policies, these falter without capable, resourced, and stable institutions. We've talked about MDDA, but I think we can talk about that across the ecosystem, including ICASA as the regulator. We've also mentioned the idea of this romanticized notion of community as a place where everyone lives together in harmony, not really factoring sufficiently local politics, factionalism, potential for capture. I think it's no secret state capture has been a big issue, and so there's no doubt that this has filtered through to the community media sector as well. There's a big issue around commercial models in these kinds of contexts where the market alone cannot sustain independent media in marginalized areas. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of debate about this in the discussion. The role of civil society cannot be underscored, I think, not only in the early years, but throughout when there have been threats against the media. Even though we say we rank very highly, every now and then something comes up. And again, it's been civil society that has played such a critical role. I think the gap here is they also struggle with sustainability. The issue of state communication spending is a double-edged sword. It's without a doubt a lifeline for many community projects, particularly in marginalized areas. But this needs transparency. There's the risk of political leverage if there are no safeguards. And critically, inequality is the root challenge. Deep socioeconomic divides shape media access, shape governance, and viability. And on that note, I'll hand over to Franz.
Thanks. Thanks, Jayshree. So we end up with a couple of recommendations. And I guess at the core of it is this idea of a policy on information rights. We ended up with a very strong sense that very often the issue of access for disadvantaged communities was kind of folded into other policy initiatives. And as a result of the complexity of technical issues and others, it kind of got lost. So the current white paper that is being put forward around regulation and around audiovisual policies, makes that gesture towards equality of access, but effectively it buries the question under and certainly technically very complex questions about platform power, around content moderation, and so on and so forth. And what we're saying really is actually we need to focus very directly on access. And we mean access in this context, not in the freedom of information sense of making sure that documents are accessible, but of making sure that people across the socioeconomic divide do have access, reasonable access to information. So we recommend that needs to be the starting point, and that we need to look at the environment through that lens very sharply. And I'll come back to this question of various mechanisms for support. We're saying that we think that support for radio, print, television, and digital initiatives needs to be platform agnostic. So we need to focus on the areas that are in greatest need, on the margins of the information society, and work out what is needed there. Whatever support system should be provided should provide safeguards against capture. I mean, Jayshree mentioned the various things, and we came across so many stories. A local mayor in Rustenburg, actually, who made an attempt to buy out the local newspaper and then blocked access to municipal advertising when he was unsuccessful. So there's a lot of this stuff that goes on, and it goes on out beyond the spotlight, so to speak. We feel very strongly that the overall landscape needs to be looked at. So institutions like the MDDA clearly need an overhaul, new funding sources. And we also feel that the MDDA should focus less strongly on short-term project support as they do, and think really about the interventions that shift the landscape as a whole. And then, as you can see, we feel that there should be levies as an additional additional income stream. I do need to just refer briefly, and I suspect we'll come back to this, to the report that came out in the last couple of days from the Competition Commission on the MDPMI review. And I think it's very interesting that one of the things that they do is that they also put they take a rights-based approach. So they take as the starting point what is needed, the question, what is needed to make sure that people get their rights to information. And I think there are a couple of other overlaps that we can point to. So we've already made mention of this question of state communication spending. I mean, there is this long-standing promise of giving 30% of communication spending to local and community media, which has never been met. What is interesting, though, is that we don't really know how much is being spent. One of the complications there is that the spending is not only at the level of GCIS. Every water board, every province, every state entity have a communication spending and is able to deploy it. And we're arguing that we need a consistent set of rules for that, because the potential for abuse is really substantial. And really we could actually do with a mechanism simply to track the way in which that money is spent across all the different entities. There is an example from Argentina. I'm sure one could look for, further for other models to improve transparency and accountability around the spending of local government money. Not only local government, but various state entities' money. I'd be interested to hear your response to this proposal for a basic income grant. We do argue, as Jayshree has also said, that the really marginal areas, the local economy is just not there that can support media in those areas. There's real advertising money, and there's certainly not very money in the community or willingness to donate that. And so we're saying that on the very far margins, it's useful to think about a basic income grant of some sort that can oversee, that can support the kind of basic functions of media in those areas. We're arguing very strongly that in that overview of the landscape, there are a lot of opportunities that can be looked at. And I think one of the things that comes out of the MDPMI report also is that there are that there are efforts, I think, within GCIS to develop those opportunities. Things like making donations to small media tax deductible. I mean, looking at the CETAs, who have an enormous pot of money and have become a bit of a black hole. And really, some of that money has been used for the community media sector, but there's a lot more potential there. So just scanning these different models in these different areas and seeing how to make it more sustainable. By the way, one of the interesting things we came across in this research is that there is a real industry of intermediaries, of people who earn a living by being intermediaries between the publishers and the broadcasters on the one hand and advertisers on the other. And some of them do a really good job, and others are frankly quite shady. And I think it would be interesting to see whether even the membership organizations like NCRF or AIP could take some measures to kind of get a handle on that, even if it's on the level of a blacklist or something of people who really behave quite badly. So there's a bunch of things we think that can be done, which would need a much closer look than we've been able to give it. And then I think the final slide, Jayshree. Yeah, so just kind of taking a step back and looking more broadly what this means. Of course, South Africa is a special case, and we have our own dynamics, our own history, our own challenges, and it shapes, where we've ended up. But we do feel that pattern of inequality of media, an attempt to extend media reach in a situation where socioeconomic inequality is closely matched with information inequality. We think that there are lessons there that may be of interest to others, particularly in the global south. We think that a lot more thought needs to go into AI. And again, the MDPMI report has gone some distance in that direction. But clearly there's a lot more work to be done to understand how that disruption is going to affect local and community media. And then just as a kind of general point, I guess, we really need to develop a policy which balances inclusivity, resilience, and again, resistance to capture, and an adaptability to technological change. And let me stop there and let's see where we go from there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Franz. I wonder if I could invite Kate, who's going to provide a bit of a response before we open up for questions. And just a reminder to everyone tuned in, please pop your questions into the Q&A section and I will raise them after Kate is done. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for this amazing opportunity to respond to this important study. So I think what is critical about this report is that it does actually give some quite systematic, thoughtful research to this very under-researched area. If you look at policy discussions, it's generally, as the report says, around the SABC and some of the bigger media operations. So it's really important to have it looking at the so-called marginal media, the community media sector. Also, I have to say that in terms of this research, what I find useful is that we've literally synthesized 3 decades of policy, politics, and practice into a single framework that helps us understand what worked, what is unraveled, and where the gaps remain. I think also one of the things that is quite useful to look at is these kind of shifts in the policy environment. And I like the fact that there's a kind of periodization, like 2 periods that the research looks at. The first phase, which is the kind of more idealistic phase, where the infrastructure is put in place. And then the second phase, which is more kind of about fragmentation. So just the first phase, just very quickly to just say this again. So what was that first phase? Creation of a community the creation of community broadcasting as a distinct tier, very important, the formation of an independent regulator, the restructuring of the SABC, and most importantly, of course, for us, is this establishment of the Media Development and Diversity Agency. And what we've got here is this belief in participatory democracy, community ownership, and genuine pluralism. And then you've got a much more disruptive second phase where that early idealism collides with political turbulence, weakening state institutions, deepening inequality, and the policy vision does not disappear, but the implementation capacity does not keep pace. So you've got frequent, as the researchers just said, and as Franz and Jayshree have talked about, these frequent shifts in ministers, institutional instability at the MDDA, regulatory confusion around digital migration. All of this creates an environment where community media is expected to thrive while literally the ground is moving beneath them. So I think that this periodization does actually help us understand how community media has and how that trajectory has been shaped. So what I want to just focus on now is just what has changed and what has not, and then to look at some of the key recommendations that come out of the report and comment on those. So I think what is useful is to say that, of course, despite all of these kind of problems, the landscape has shifted enormously. And I mean, I think it's important that the report talks to the fact that, we literally have 230 community radio stations, just over 200 independent publications, 5 community TV stations, and during apartheid, these pretty much none of these existed. So that growth is significant, and it shows that the early reforms did expand the media ecosystem. But, and I think this is what goes to the heart of things, these deep inequalities persist. So this, what we hoped to do post-apartheid was to ensure that that these particular communities, poorer communities, were the focus. But unfortunately, the deep inequalities we couldn't actually shift those. And so this exclusion, which was there under apartheid, continues post-apartheid. And I think also what is really important to look at, because this has real important impact in terms of the recommendations that we put forward, is just that this inequality leads to this incredible vulnerability of small media. This instability, the governance conflicts, the pressures from local politicians, the extraordinary low budget, these are not peripheral issues. They directly shape editorial independence and sustainability. And I want to talk to some research that has recently been released and platformed by AIP. In fact, we were talking about it at our anniversary dinner on Thursday. And this is some research called Costing Community News, Assessing the Value and Constraints of Small Publishers in South Africa. And this research was done by Power Law and Acacia Economics. And what I think is interesting is that it talks about 44% of publications earning less than 100,000 Rand a year, and on average, and this is particularly, I'm talking about from my perspective, the industry in terms of small publishers, but they literally, a lot of publications are operating at a loss of 12%. So what we showed is that in terms of our research, which was completed in June of this year, that the situation is actually deteriorated even further, because this report, the report, that Franz, Sarah, Chiumbu, and Jayshree have put forward, talk about 250,000 Rand annual turnover, but we are talking literally about 100,000 Rand, in terms of what is earned. So the report does this costing analysis, and then what it does is it looks at what is required in terms of basically covering the shortfalls, just in terms of AIP members, but then looks at what the entire sector needs in terms of funding. And it comes up with a figure of dealing with the shortfalls, covering, the major communities in South Africa. And it talks about an amount of 400 million Rand being needed, basically for to cover the South African landscape. And this is just with community publications. So that's quite a significant amount of money that it basically points to in terms of covering everything that is needed. So let me talk quickly about some of the things which I thought were really interesting in terms of the recommendations and particular observations made by this report. So one of the things is this very interesting point about the idealized view of community that often, regulators and policymakers had. And of course, community is not, ideal. I mean, there are all sorts of issues around contestation. And so what the report talks about, and I think it's super helpful, is this policy and regulations must be designed not for ideal conditions, but for real communities marked by inequality, political contestation, and limited resources. And so for me, this is one of the really important contributions of the report. And in fact, what we've been looking at as an industry body is just the fact that you actually need to set up specific structures to deal with that contestation, so that it isn't disruptive. Another very critical point that I think that the research points to is this issue of sustainability and the core unresolved issue that not every station or publication will eventually be financially self-sufficient. I think that's an absolutely critical point, and often the institutions that work in the sector do not actually recognize that. And therefore, I think the point that is made in this report about the need for a basic income grant for small media on the particular margins is critical. What I think the challenge to the research team and to all of us is to take this proposal further. Where can we find this funding? What funding model would underpin it? Where should such a grant be housed? How should eligibility be defined? Could it be tied to clearly measurable public interest journalism outputs? So I think this is definitely an area for future research and policy innovation. Then I just want to about a further thing which I thought was very interesting was this idea of strengthening institutions and modernizing support, and the report's call to review and strengthen existing institutions rather than creating entirely new ones. And then this idea of a dedicated office or agency to continuously scan the environment, identifying trends, risks, and opportunities. Again, I think this is really important. We need that particular focus on community media. But where should this particular structure sit? Should it be inside the MDDA? Should it be separate? What expertise is needed? So given the MDDA's original mandate, it could potentially be very useful to have it there, but also could be separate. It could be a specific sector task team, including the MDDA, industry bodies, and researchers, but I think a very, very useful input there. And then there's obviously some very interesting things about the MDDA itself in terms of what is required in terms of making the institution more resilient and able to fulfill its role in the sector. And I think very briefly to say, some of the needs are, which are pointed out in the report: stable leadership, stronger independence, more diversified funding, a shift from short-term grants towards longer-term institutional support, a more nuanced understanding of sustainability in poor communities, which I've referred to already. And then, this is probably going to sound very self-interested, but support to industry bodies such as AIP, the NCRF, etc., because I think we do work on a macro level and therefore can particularly assist, individual, publishers, stations, etc. Then I want to very briefly talk about the government communication spending, because I think it's really critical. And if you look at the amount of money that comes from the MDDA versus what potentially can come out through government advertising is a much more key resource. And so I want to talk to the issues around some of the points that the research team highlighted, which is, that transparency that we need, knowing exactly how much money is spent, and at those various levels. We really do need to understand that. And then the critical issue around the intermediaries, and looking at those intermediaries, how they operate, some very well, as pointed out by the researchers, but some actually very problematically, and a huge amount of resources going into those intermediaries and not into the sector, and that creating a huge problem. So yeah, I think there's some important work that we need to do there. I think also what the report talks to, and these are just my final points, is just the low-hanging fruit. There are a lot of points that are made here about tax incentives for donations to small publishers and stations, better access to SMME support programs specifically for small publishers, stronger partnerships between community media and public institutions such as universities, integration of community media into local development strategies, using existing grant infrastructure more effectively. And what I wanted to point to is this very useful research that has been done, in fact, by GCIS. There's a whole report on print and digital media transformation and revitalization. And I think that the recommendations that come out of that report are very useful, and I think dovetail with some of the very important work done here in this research, and utilizing them and looking at them together, I think could be very helpful. So the last thing that I want to look at now is just the very critical points around the Competition Commission and what came out of the Competition Commission last week, Thursday. The Competition Commission, of course, and I think this is something that is very powerful about that report, is it looks at community media very specifically, and looks at some specific mechanisms that should be put in place. And it talks to the Digital News Transformation Fund, which AIP has played quite a key role in establishing. But of course, this is not an AIP fund. This is a fund for the industry, for small and medium-sized publishers. What I think is interesting about the report is it looks at it and says, yes, this is critical, it must be there. It talks about its independent governance structures. It talks about the amount of money that needs to go out to the sector, which is in total over 3 years, 114 million rand. It talks to the fact that actually this should be extended for a further 2 years. But interestingly, the money is not secured. It's matching funding. I think originally when I read the report, I thought that's fantastic, a further 19 million for year 4 and year 5. But actually that money will not come into the sector unless another donor is prepared to come in first and match that funding. So I think what the report, the competition report, talks about this D&T fund. It also talks about further funding in terms of this AI innovation fund. It also talks about funding that is going to come through in terms of training. But of course, that training is not just for the community media sector. It's for the sector as a whole, but with a certain small component of it going to the MDDA in terms of indigenous language kind of training and support. But I think when you look at those sums of funding, they're not very large. And when you look at the huge needs of the sector, and you're looking at a potential basic income grant as part of that, those are some of the things that I think that we need to focus on. How do we do that when the amounts of funding are very small and the needs are very large? And I think the only thing that I can kind of put forward very squarely on the agenda is this collaboration between all of these different groupings in order to take what is pretty small and amplify that. So let me leave it there. Franz, Jayshree, but I think a very useful report with some very key findings. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. A lot there. I was making notes furiously, so many questions to ask. Let me just go back to Franz and Jayshree to ask if they have any responses that they want to add in now. And then there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that we will raise.
Not particularly, but if I may just show you a map very briefly.
Sure.
One of the things that we did for the purposes of this report, and it's somewhere, is we try to see where the news deserts are. And I mean, Kate kicked off her comments by making that point about the the kind of unequal distribution of media. What you're looking at is at a district municipality level, how many local media exist in different places. The lighter colours are fewer, the darker colours are more. And you can see very clearly, Joburg has 29, right, local media. Cape Town has 16, eThekwini, Durban has 15, and so it goes on. And of course, these areas out in the in the less populated areas have very, very few. There are a couple of oddities here, which are interesting. For instance, Nelson Mandela Bay, which is a significant metro, has very few actually local media. And then there are these areas in the north and the east which have quite a lot. But it just gives a kind of visual representation, and you can see exactly that even the media on the margins cluster where there is money. Provincial capitals, the big industrial areas. But no, I think thanks, Kate, for your comments and for your input. Much that we can take further, but let's go to questions because our time is limited.
Thanks, Franz. Can I just start off just quickly by asking in terms of the research, because you talk about news deserts and then you're talking about local media. Are we using those terms interchangeably? And can I just confirm that there was no kind of substantial analysis of what the local media contributed in terms of local news? Because obviously the concept of news is quite contested. But yeah, just to say, to confirm that you used a very loose definition of local media.
We used a fairly loose definition, that's right. I mean, we were looking at the kind of availability of local journalistic media, radio and print primarily, across different parts of the country.
Thanks for that. Let me go to the questions. There are two from Peter. I'm going to start off with the top one, which says, thanks for great insights. Can you elaborate a bit more on how to organize the platform agnostic support that you talk about in the research? And also to talk about what you recommend to neighboring countries in terms of what they can copy or adapt from the South African context. Jayshree or Franz?
Jayshree, why don't you?
Franz, you go for it.
Okay, well, it seems to me that support that's organized, whether it's by way of direct government subsidy or by way of mechanism of various kinds of mechanisms, should be platform agnostic. In other words, it should not ask the question, are you a radio station or are you a television station or an online medium? It should ask, how effectively are you able to service local communication and information and news needs? And thanks to Nesh for sharpening that distinction, because of course those are different things. So really, currently support is very much organized on a platform basis. If you're a radio station, you have access to streams of income through the MDDA. If you're a print product or an online product, far fewer, simply because of the platform that you use. And we think that and of course that has historical reasons which one understands, and because of the income that the MDDA itself gets. But I think really the question that should be asked as a starting point is, how effectively are you serving local needs in terms of information and news? Lessons to be learned, I guess. Yes.
Can I follow up there? Because I think one of the crucial questions for me is, how do you also include media outlets or information providers that are not on the classical media outlets, so neither print, radio, nor TV, but that might even be on digital platforms. As an example, at the AIJC the week before last, we had the Ponderland Times in one of the workshops on TikTok, and they are actually active on TikTok. And I know at the moment they also do have a print publication, but I think as audiences move towards digital platforms, how do we also include the digital platforms and support to the information providers on those platforms?
Sure, and clearly those digital platforms have to be have to be able to attract the same kind of support that others do. There's a very interesting publisher that's a member of AIP who publishes, in fact, there are more than one, but the one that I'm thinking of is Barberton, that publishes a newspaper that appears as a WhatsApp file distributed on a PDF file that is distributed on WhatsApp. I see Nigel Mugamu from Zimbabwe is here, who has a very interesting digital model. So again, I mean, I think that the way to do that is to say you're entitled to support if you are doing a certain kind of work, a certain kind of information sharing work. You're reaching audiences, you're producing public service content. The platform really is secondary. So if it's a YouTube channel or it's a PDF on WhatsApp or it's whatever it is, I think you should be entitled to support. And I think that kind of nuanced approach to support, I think, it would be very productive.
Thanks, Franz. I see Kate's hand is up. If I could just ask her to come in quickly. I think it's related.
Yes, it is. So I think that's such an important question, because I think the big thing for us is actually we are encouraging, our publications to move online and to have all sorts of different digital products. And if you look at the Digital News Transformation Fund, it's specifically about that. It's to ensure that publications are operating multi-platform. And the big issue there is membership of the Press Council. So are you ethical? Do you follow a code? Can you be held to account? And whether you then a podcast, on WhatsApp or whatever, as long as you are a member of the Press Council and you can be held to account, then you should be supported. But it's a very, very important question. Thanks.
Thanks, colleagues. I just want to move on to Dimitri's question. Peter, I'm aware that you have another question there, but I'm going to skip you for a second. And Dimitri's asking very particularly about the 30% allocation that's been talked about for a long time to community media. And I know, Kate, the Deputy Minister in the Presidency, Kenny Moraleng, spoke about this quite emphatically at the AIP celebrations this past week. Has there been any sort of formal commitments or any formal movement on this 30% allocation? And I'll open it up to all of you in order to address the question.
So let me kick off with what I know, Dinesh. As far as I know, there is this policy in a kind of general sense, but implementation simply has not kind of taken off. Partly, and I think the main reason really is that the spending is so diffuse. You need to create a framework that applies to the water boards, to the district councils, to local municipalities, to all sorts of entities, and actually making that happen is quite complicated. Secondly, I think that there just hasn't been the political will to do it. And then, of course, spenders of the money also raise kind of administrative issues and questions of returns on money, and capturing all that into a system or an approach that works just has escaped. It just hasn't happened. I don't think that GCIS has reported on the actual proportion of government spend being channeled through them. As I'm looking at Dimitri's questions here. As I say, that would be a good starting point, is to actually determine exactly how much. We came across one or two places where figures were given, and I don't have them right in front of me right now, about a relationship between the proportion that was going to local media, local and community media, but it was certainly way below the 30%. It is not a sustained estimate. It looked, these were kind of presentations in Parliament. And yeah, one isn't quite sure exactly how certain that figure is. Yeah, and then of course, as you say, Dimitri, it is also a question of reach, and the Argentinian example makes that point, is that when you are spending public money, you have to make sure that it reaches the right people. Is there a potential tension with SABC's demands? Well, I suppose potentially yes. But I think that to build into government's decisions about spending a notion of also supporting the local media as well as the SABC, I think is doable. It just needs a bit of smartness and a bit of political will to do it.
Thanks so much for that. Kate, I think you want to come in?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I think that Franz is absolutely correct that the problem has been that you haven't. It's very difficult to actually look at that across all the different levels of government. But I think that one of the things that needs to be done, and possibly this could be done through the D&T fund, is a proposal is put into the D&T fund to do that research, to look at what is happening across government departments and the GCIS itself, and then also, as you're saying, parastatals. But I think that that what is actually needed. I mean, government has all sorts of different needs, etc. Different priorities, and it's never going to actually get going until somebody takes that on. And I believe that would be a very powerful project that could actually be supported by the D&T fund, because it is the D&T fund is about digital transformation, but also key to it is sustainability. So I think that's how we get it going. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kate. I wonder if I could ask all of you, it just seems to me that the kind of community agitation that we had in the transition phase leading up to the IBA Act and so on and so forth has fizzled out. And the people who seem to be advocating for sustainability, for grassroots media and whatnot, are people who are in formal scenarios. So either in community newsrooms, or journalists working in commercial spaces, or actual media activists. But that community agitation for resources to sustain local community media isn't there. Is that correct to say, Kate? And what can we do about that?
So not entirely. I mean, I think it's a very important point, and I'm glad you're raising it, Dinesh. But I think that as part of the research that we did in costing community media, we actually did an audience survey, and what we discovered from that audience survey was how valued community media was, and that actually, when just in terms of issues of trust, I mean, people looked at they were asked the question, do you trust your community media, or do you trust the kind of information that you receive on digital platforms? And what I thought was very helpful was just the issue around the fact that people said, no, I mean, if we look at both, we actually trust our community publications, etc., more, and community media more. So I think the thing is that we need to do a lot more research in terms of audiences, what they want, how they want it. And so that is a big area. But certainly from our initial research with audiences, there was a huge positive response that came from them. So I think it's just really an under-researched area. But yeah, probably more actives are required as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. I see Jayshree's hand. Jayshree?
Thanks, Dinesh. I'm probably adding another element, but it was really stimulated by the question Dimitri asked about SABC and community media. I think one of the gaps in the research is that we don't really focus on Centec. And it's a big cost driver for both the public broadcaster and for commercial broadcasters. And I think it's a dimension that I hope others will really look into, because I think at the heart of the sustainability and the fighting over resources is that the Centec distribution costs, signal distribution costs, are high for both the public broadcaster and community media. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Jayshree. I'm going to pick up another question from Martin Jansen. So the MDDA seems to operate on an outdated model of community media support, neglecting online print and AV media, and historically has not operated efficiently and fairly. What can we do to improve the MDDA and the funding part? Jayshree, I think you're a member of the board. We also have Jayshree, who is the executive director, on the call. So it would be great to hear from you, but also any of the panelists who want to chime in. Thank you.
Sure, let me go first and say that I think the MDDA does recognize that, that the legislation, it's also a creature of statute. There are regulations, it's an act. So it's not, that is the landscape that really has to shift. And I think that is starting to come into play. It's been talked about, but I think there's renewed energy to move this further. That is a big part of the stumbling blocks. I think there's clear recognition that, of course, this these regulations were written 30 years ago almost. The landscape has shifted so much, but I think what that means is going, with limited resources, is still going to be a question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just want to say, it seems like statute becomes a big stumbling block over time, simply because it's not context relevant anymore. So it feels overwhelming, but it seems like an overhaul is long overdue in many respects across the media landscape in the country. Let me go to a comment from Zoe Titus. Zoe, of course, is with the Namibian Media Trust. Thank you for your comment, Zoe. It says, glad to see the link being made to media accountability systems. These are key to keeping journalism rooted in the public interest, where media serve communities with information that enables participation and so on. Thank you so much. And then a point from Guy Berger, Prof. Guy Berger, who is also very well known in this landscape. The big Ndlovu in the room, responsible for inequality, the volume of failures of the ruling party and its likely resistance to your remedies. Or are there serious opportunities within the political status quo? I'm trying to disentangle that question, Guy, but if anyone has managed, please go ahead. Kate or Franz or Jayshree.
Well, let me try.
Okay.
Certainly, the political environment is not particularly conducive. I think one accepts that. And it's difficult from all sorts of points of view. I mean, starting from kind of budgetary pressures, the international environment, the kind of fragmenting political space, and so on, and so forth. I would just say that doesn't mean that we should start thinking about solutions, that we should stop thinking about solutions. I mean, I think that, you were saying, Dinesh, you were talking about the necessity of civil society action. And by the way, it is interesting, as Michael Markovitz said about the Competition Commission inquiry that's just been released, that actually the input of civil society, led by SANEF and others, played a major role in shaping that outcome. And certainly when it comes to putting blue sky proposals on the table, like a basic income grant, that's probably going to be a tough call. But things like reviewing the landscape, I mean, there is work currently underway in GCIS. And I think the underlying points still need to be made. The underlying points about the nature of inequality and the impact of that, and the need to think in a much more nuanced way, as Kate has said, about what it means to build greater information inequality. So the short answer is, yeah, it's a tough call at the moment, but we should make it nevertheless.
Dinesh, can I add?
So much, Kate? Yeah, sure.
So Guy, I think that it is actually an important moment, because I think funding is coming into the sector at the moment. So if I look at the D&T fund and I look at the funding that is coming in, for the mainstream media, the 71 million, a year over 5 years, I know the mainstream media is very unhappy about that in terms of the amount of money. But the fact is that there is a focus on the media sector, both at the level of small media and at the mainstream, and there are various funds being set up. And I think that is actually really focusing the mind in terms of various possibilities. And I think, interestingly, although initially when I heard that the year 4 and 5, in terms of that 19 million was not guaranteed, we needed matching funding. In another way, it's amazing, because basically what it's saying is go out to the corporate sector, go out to the other tech platforms and get that money in. And the idea around matching funding means that, there's a sense of we need to put more money into the sector, but also focus the mind on what we could do. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity at the moment. There's a lot of energy in the sector, I feel, in terms of thinking through new things, and particularly thinking about things in terms of the digital migration. And so I think it's potentially an exciting time. And when I look at SANEF and I look at a number of the civil society organizations, I think they're very energized. I think there's a lot to do, and the mind can be focused, I think, at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kate. I think it certainly does feel like we're over that survivalist moment and into the age of innovation and, a new phase of building, as it were. Colleagues, I'm going to start to wrap up. We are very much on time, very much at the end. Thank you all for joining us. But I just want to ask very quickly if I could go around the room for colleagues to give me their one key takeaway from this policy, from this report, in terms of moving forward, in terms of that rebuilding that we're talking about. Franz, if I could come to you, I know you're busy typing a response.
Sorry, I was just trying to respond to one or two points in the chat. One thing, if I'm allowed to, firstly is to understand the complexity of the reality of what's going on the ground. And I think empirically, it's been so fascinating to find out how people publish, how people broadcast under most difficult circumstances. So really unpacking that with the politics and the tensions and so on. And secondly, to use Kate's phrase of aiming for low-hanging fruit. Some of the things that we're identifying are really kind of, are probably difficult to achieve, but I think there are things that we can achieve. And I think those are the things that we should aim for. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Jayshree?
I think for me, it's really, given our history, not to lose sight of the idea of public service, media, information rights. I think that discourse even is really getting eroded, particularly in the sustainability debate. We're seeing it in terms of the SABC as well. It's like this public service mandate is an albatross, for example. You'd hear that even in Parliament, for example. So I think that's critical for me.
Thank you so much. And Kate, if I could come to you lastly.
Yeah, so I think that for me, one of the big issues is just this understanding of sustainability and that there will be certain media that will never be sustainable, that will need ongoing funding, and that we have to just face that, front on and say, what do we do if that is in fact the case? And then looking at ongoing funding for that, and literally how do we do that? So I think that's one of the important points that I picked up from the report. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. And let me say from my side, I think that, community media in South Africa in particular is information rights in action. It really does. And for me, moving forward, is that as we realize that there is a strong need for collaboration between what was previously known as the mainstream and between community media, that we guard against extractivist practices and ensure that our community media sector stands on its own and is able to speak for itself. Colleagues, I thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I think there will be a link provided for the actual report. It's available on the DW Akademie website if you Google it or if you use the link. But thank you so much for your engagement this afternoon and for joining us on this Wits Centre for Journalism webinar. Thank you so much.